If you were born between 1997 and 2012, statistically speaking, you're more likely to experience anxiety, depression, and feelings of hopelessness than any generation before you. Not slightly more, significantly more. Studies show that Gen Z reports the highest levels of mental health struggles in recorded history, with nearly 42% experiencing anxiety disorders compared to just 27% of millennials, and even less in older generations. And this isn't just about people being more open about mental health. Something fundamental has changed in how your generation experiences the world. In the next 25 minutes, we're going to dissect the psychology, neuroscience, and social factors that created what experts are calling a mental health crisis. From the smartphones in your pocket to the economic system you inherited, from social media algorithms to the collapse of traditional social structures, we're breaking down why your anxiety isn't personal failure. It's a predictable response to unprecedented conditions. Let's decode the crisis. Welcome back to Psychepath, where we decode your mind. If you're Gen Z or want to understand what an entire generation is facing, hit subscribe because this gets deep. Let's start with the data because it's staggering. According to the American Psychological Association's 2023 report, Gen Z adults are more likely than any other generation to report poor mental health. 91% of Gen Z adults experienced at least one physical or emotional symptom due to stress in the past month. That's 9 out of 10 people. The rates of diagnosed anxiety disorders in Gen Z are double what they were in millennials at the same age. Suicide rates among teenagers and young adults have increased by over 50% since 2007. Loneliness, despite being the most digitally connected generation in history, is at epidemic levels. And perhaps most telling, Gen Z is less likely to say their mental health is excellent or very good than any generation before them, including those who lived through world wars and economic depressions. So the question isn't whether there's a crisis. The question is why. What changed? What is it about being born in this specific window of time that created these conditions? The first and most obvious factor is technology, but not in the way most people think. It's not that screens are inherently bad or that social media is evil. It's about timing. Gen Z is the first generation to go through critical developmental stages, adolescence in particular, with smartphones and social media as a constant presence. Your brain development from ages 10 to 25 is crucial. This is when neural pathways solidify, when your sense of identity forms, when you learn how to regulate emotions and navigate social hierarchies. And for Gen Z, this entire process happened while algorithms were competing for your attention, while your social life was being quantified into likes and followers, while your brain was being rewired by infinite scroll and dopamine-driven notification systems. Neuroscience research shows that constant social media use during adolescence alters the development of the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and emotional regulation. It's not that you're weak. It's that your brain was shaped by technology in ways previous generations weren't. Let's talk about social media specifically, because this is where it gets dark. Psychologist Jonathan Haidt's research demonstrates that starting around 2012, when smartphones became ubiquitous and social media platforms shifted to algorithmically curated feeds, there was a sharp and sudden increase in anxiety and depression rates among adolescents, particularly girls. Why 2012? That's when Instagram introduced infinite scroll, when Facebook shifted from chronological feeds to engagement-maximizing algorithms, when Snapchat introduced streaks, creating artificial pressure to maintain daily contact, when the entire experience shifted from connecting with friends to performing for an audience. And here's the psychological trap. Social media creates what's called social comparison on steroids. Humans have always compared themselves to others. That's normal. But historically, you compared yourself to people in your immediate environment. Your classmates, your neighbors, people whose lives you could actually observe and contextualize. Now you're comparing yourself to hundreds or thousands of people, and you're seeing only their highlight reels, their best moments, their curated perfection. Your brain doesn't have the evolutionary wiring to handle this. It interprets these comparisons as real, as accurate reflections of how your life should be. And when your reality doesn't match, it triggers feelings of inadequacy, failure, and worthlessness. But it's not just about comparison. It's about validation. Social media turns social approval into a measurable, quantifiable metric. Every post becomes a test. Did people like it? Did it get enough engagement? Are people responding? Your self-worth becomes externalized, dependent on the reactions of others, many of whom are strangers or acquaintances you barely know. Psychologically, this creates what's called an external locus of control, where your sense of value comes from outside yourself rather than internal self-assessment. Research shows that people with external locus of control are significantly more prone to anxiety because they feel powerless. They can't control how others respond. They're at the mercy of algorithms, trends, and the whims of an audience. And for Gen Z, who grew up with this as normal, it's become the baseline. Many of you have never experienced a sense of self that isn't filtered through social validation. That's not a character flaw. That's environmental conditioning. Now let's add the second major factor, economic anxiety. Gen Z is inheriting an economic landscape that's fundamentally broken compared to what previous generations experienced. You're entering adulthood at a time when housing is unaffordable, student debt is crippling, job security is non-existent, wages have stagnated for decades, while cost of living has skyrocketed and the social contract that promised education equals good job equals stable life has completely collapsed. Your parents' generation could work a part-time job through college and graduate debt-free. You can work full-time and still struggle to afford rent. Boomers could buy a house at 25 with a single income. You're watching homeownership become a distant fantasy. This isn't about being entitled or lazy. The data is clear. Adjusted for inflation and cost of living, Gen Z has significantly less purchasing power and economic mobility than any generation since the Great Depression. And psychologically, economic insecurity is one of the strongest predictors of anxiety. When you don't know if you'll be able to afford basic needs, when you're constantly stressed about money, when you see no path to financial stability despite doing everything right, your brain enters a state of chronic stress. Your amygdala, the fear center, is constantly activated. Your cortisol levels stay elevated, and over time, this becomes generalized anxiety that permeates every aspect of your life. Factor 3. The collapse of traditional social structures and the rise of loneliness. Previous generations had built-in social frameworks, church communities, neighborhood connections, local social clubs, stable long-term employment where you'd work with the same people for decades. These structures provided automatic social connection, a sense of belonging, and shared identity. Gen Z has seen these institutions crumble. Religious affiliation is at historic lows. People don't know their neighbors. Job hopping is the norm. Even friend groups are more fragmented because digital communication replaces face-to-face interaction. The result, record levels of loneliness. Studies show that despite being the most connected generation digitally, Gen Z reports feeling more isolated than elderly people in nursing homes. That's a staggering statistic. And loneliness isn't just emotional discomfort. It's a legitimate health crisis. Research from UCLA and other institutions shows that chronic loneliness has the same health impact as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It increases inflammation, weakens immune function, and significantly increases rates of anxiety and depression. Your brain is wired for connection, for physical presence, for reading facial expressions and body language and vocal tone. Digital interaction doesn't fulfill these needs. It mimics connection without providing the psychological nourishment that in-person relationships offer. Let's add factor 4, information overload and the collapse of shared reality. Gen Z has grown up in an environment of constant information bombardment, news cycles that update by the minute, endless content across platforms, exposure to global crises in real time, climate change, political instability, pandemics, school shootings, economic collapse, social injustice, all streaming directly into your consciousness 24/7. Previous generations experienced disasters too, but they were filtered through newspapers or evening news broadcasts. There was distance, processing time, a sense of control over information consumption. Gen Z has none of that. The result is what psychologists call headline stress disorder, a chronic state of low-level anxiety caused by constant exposure to negative news and information you can't do anything about. Your brain wasn't designed to process global-scale problems constantly. It creates a sense of helplessness, of impending doom, of being overwhelmed by problems too big to solve. And when you add in the breakdown of shared reality, where misinformation, conspiracy theories, and algorithmic echo chambers mean that people can't even agree on basic facts anymore, it creates existential uncertainty that fuels anxiety. Factor 5. The pressure of identity formation in a hypervisible world. Adolescence has always been about figuring out who you are, experimenting with identity, making mistakes, learning from them. But for Gen Z, this process happens under constant documentation and public scrutiny. Every phase, every mistake, every cringy moment is potentially recorded, shared, and permanently archived. This creates what psychologists call identity foreclosure, where young people feel pressured to lock into a fixed identity, prematurely because they're afraid of being judged for inconsistency or change. There's also the phenomenon of performative identity, where you're not just discovering who you are, you're curating a public persona for consumption. Am I posting the right things? Do my values align with my online presence? Will people call me out for past statements that no longer reflect who I am? This constant self-monitoring is exhausting and anxiety-inducing. It prevents the natural fluidity of identity development that previous generations experienced in relative privacy. Factor 6, and this is crucial, the collapse of future optimism. Every generation has faced challenges, but most could look toward the future with at least some degree of hope. The belief that things would get better, that progress was possible, that hard work would lead to improvement. Gen Z is the first generation in modern history to widely believe that the future will be worse than the present. Climate anxiety is real. You're inheriting a planet in crisis with leaders who seem unable or unwilling to address it meaningfully. Political polarization has reached levels where democratic systems feel broken. Technological advancement, instead of being optimistic, is creating fears about job displacement through AI surveillance, loss of privacy. Even the concept of retirement feels like a joke. When you believe the future is bleak, when you can't imagine a scenario where things improve, it creates what psychologists call learned helplessness. Why try? Why plan? Why invest in long-term goals when the system feels rigged and the planet feels doomed? This existential hopelessness is a breeding ground for anxiety and depression. Now let's talk about parenting styles, because this matters. Gen Z was largely raised by Gen X and older millennial parents who, with good intentions, created what psychologists call overprotective or helicopter parenting environments. The goal was safety, protection from harm, optimization of outcomes. But the unintended consequence was a generation that had fewer opportunities to develop resilience through manageable risk and failure. Free play decreased. Unsupervised exploration became rare. Every activity was structured, monitored, optimized. This created what psychologists Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt call a culture of safetyism, where emotional comfort is prioritized over challenge and growth. The result? Many Gen Z individuals report feeling unprepared for adult challenges, lacking confidence in their ability to handle discomfort, and experiencing anxiety when faced with situations that require independent problem-solving. This isn't about being coddled. It's about being deprived of the experiences that build psychological resilience. Previous generations learned to handle anxiety by facing it in small doses throughout childhood. Gen Z often didn't get those opportunities. Factor 8. The pandemic. For older Gen Z, critical years of development, late teens and early 20s, were disrupted by COVID-19. Social isolation during formative periods, educational disruption, economic uncertainty, the loss of milestone experiences like graduation, first jobs, travel, social exploration. The psychological impact of this collective trauma is still unfolding, but early research shows significant increases in anxiety, depression, and feelings of having lost time or opportunity. And unlike older generations who experienced the pandemic as adults with established identities and coping mechanisms, Gen Z experienced it during crucial developmental windows. The long-term psychological effects are still being studied, but they're undeniably significant. Here's where we need to address a common criticism. Aren't Gen Z just being dramatic? Didn't previous generations face worse and handle it better? This argument misses the point. Yes, previous generations faced wars, economic depressions, and hardship, but they faced them within social structures that provided support, with clear enemies or problems to fight against, with communal coping mechanisms and shared purpose. Gen Z faces a different kind of crisis. It's diffuse, chronic, systemic, and atomized. There's no single enemy to rally against. The problems are global and feel unsolvable. The support structures are gone, and the crisis is happening inside your head. Invisible, difficult to articulate, easy to dismiss. Comparing trauma across generations is pointless. What matters is understanding the specific psychological conditions creating this generation's mental health crisis. So, what's the way forward? First, awareness. Understanding that your anxiety isn't personal failure. It's a predictable response to unprecedented conditions. This doesn't mean you're powerless, but it does mean you can stop blaming yourself for struggling. Second, intentional technology use. You can't opt out of the digital world, but you can change how you engage with it. Setting boundaries around social media, curating your feeds intentionally, taking regular digital detoxes. These aren't luxuries, they're mental health necessities. Third, building real-world connections, prioritizing in-person relationships, joining communities based on shared interests, creating face-to-face social rituals. Your brain needs physical presence. Fourth, therapy and professional help. There's no shame in this. If you had a broken leg, you'd see a doctor. Your mental health deserves the same attention. Fifth, political and systemic engagement. Individual coping strategies matter, but so does collective action. Advocating for economic reform, climate action, mental health resources, tech regulation, Your generation has the power to demand systemic change. Let me be very clear about something. If you're Gen Z and you're struggling, it's not because you're weak. It's not because you're entitled or dramatic. You're navigating a psychological minefield that previous generations didn't face. You're doing it with fewer resources, less stability, and more uncertainty than any generation in modern history. The fact that you're still here, still trying, still pushing forward despite all of this, that's not weakness. That's resilience. And maybe the narrative needs to shift. Maybe instead of asking why Gen Z is so anxious, we should be asking why wouldn't they be? Maybe the real question is, how is any generation supposed to maintain mental health in these conditions? And maybe the answer is to stop pathologizing the response and start fixing the systems that created the problem. So here's your challenge. If you're Gen Z, find one thing this week that's not mediated by a screen, a conversation, an activity, a moment of presence. Start there. And if you're from an older generation watching this, maybe the next time you're tempted to judge Gen Z, remember that they're not failing to thrive. They're thriving despite conditions designed to make it nearly impossible. Now, if this video resonated with you, the next one breaks down the neuroscience of social media addiction and how to reclaim your attention. Hit subscribe because we're building a complete guide to understanding the modern mind. And remember, your anxiety makes sense. You make sense. Keep going.